They laughed at it. The Japanese pilots, confident and battle-hardened, saw the new American fighter and burst into amusement. It looked ridiculous, almost cartoonish, with its strange inverted gull wings, an unusually long nose, and a stance that seemed awkward even when parked. To them, this bird was no eagle. It looked clumsy, like a flying mistake. They called it ungainly, compared it mockingly to their own sleek Mitsubishi A6M0, and assumed it would be nothing more than another overbuilt American experiment. They were wrong, fatally wrong. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japan ruled the skies. The Zero was unmatched, a symbol of technological superiority and martial precision. Its pilots felt untouchable, having shredded waves of older American planes, Wildcats, Buffaloes, and P-40s. So when they first saw the new American fighter, they had every reason to smirk. The aircraft was the Vought F4U Corsair, a machine that would soon rewrite the balance of power in the air, but not without first enduring ridicule, rejection, and rebirth. The Corsair's odd shape was no accident. Its gull-wing design was born from necessity, not aesthetics. The engineers at Vought were trying to fit a massive propeller, 1 over 13 feet in diameter, onto a fighter that was supposed to land on aircraft carriers. To do so, they had to lift the fuselage higher off the ground. A traditional landing gear wouldn't work. It would make the legs too long and fragile. So the wings were bent downward near the fuselage and then upward again, creating that iconic gull-wing shape. It solved a technical problem but gave the plane an unmistakable, almost menacing silhouette. The long nose housed the most powerful piston engine of its time, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, delivering over 2,000 horsepower. But that long nose also blocked the pilot's view of the runway, making landings tricky and dangerous. When the first Corsairs were delivered to the U.S. Navy in 1942, the excitement quickly turned to frustration. The plane was fast, no question about that, over 400 miles per hour, but it was also temperamental. It bounced violently on carrier landings. The tailhook often missed the arrestor cables, and the visibility on approach was dreadful. Pilots began calling it names: hose nose, bent-wing bird, and the most ominous of all, ensign eliminator. That nickname came from how many young, inexperienced pilots crashed while trying to tame it. The Navy, unimpressed and unwilling to risk its limited carriers, rejected it for carrier operations. The Corsair was grounded from its intended stage, but one branch saw potential where others saw problems: the U.S. Marine Corps. The Marines, often operating from rough island airstrips rather than carriers, didn't care if the plane was a handful on landing. They needed something fast, rugged, and capable of punching through Japanese air. Dominance. They took the Corsair and began learning how to fight with it, and more importantly, how to fight against the Zero. At first, the Marines struggled. Early engagements exposed the Corsair's quirks. If flown like a Zero, it would lose. The Japanese fighters could outturn it easily, but if flown like a hammer instead of a sword, diving, climbing, and striking with raw power, the Corsair was unmatched. Slowly, pilots began to understand the beast's nature. It wasn't a graceful dancer like the Zero. It was a predator, one that struck hard, fast, and then disappeared before the enemy could respond. By 1943, the Corsair entered real combat for the first time in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. When its engine roared across the Pacific airfields, it made a haunting, whistling sound, a byproduct of air flowing through its distinctive wing intakes. Japanese troops on the ground soon gave it a name: Whistling Death. The nickname was not born out of humor. It came from fear. The Corsair's performance was shocking. It could climb faster, dive steeper, and reach speeds that the Zero could never touch. In level flight, the Zero topped out around 330 miles per hour. The Corsair could easily exceed 400. Its armor was thick enough to shrug off 7.4mm rounds that would have shredded older American fighters, and when it fired back with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, the effect was catastrophic. A single burst could rip a Zero apart, turning its fragile aluminum frame into a ball of flame. The same Japanese pilots who once laughed now found themselves in dogfights they couldn't win. One Corsair pilot described his first encounter vividly: "I came in high and fast. The Zero tried to climb to meet me, but it just couldn't keep up. I rolled over, dove, and opened fire, 650s blazing. He never had a chance." It was the beginning of a new kind of air war, one ruled not by agility, but by speed, firepower, and tactics. The Marines quickly developed a doctrine known as boom and zoom. Instead of turning tightly with the enemy, Corsair pilots would dive from altitude, unleash a devastating burst, and then climb back up before the slower Zero could retaliate. The Japanese pilots, trained to fight in tight, swirling dogfights, were thrown off balance. Their planes, built for maneuverability, couldn't withstand steep dives or heavy punishment. Many were shot down before they even saw the Corsair that killed them. As months passed, the legend of the Corsair spread. The Japanese couldn't believe the Americans had built a piston-engine fighter that could outclass the Zero in every way that mattered. Their intelligence reports began to change tone, from dismissive to alarmed. The bent-wing monster had become a nightmare. In the words of one Japanese report, this new American fighter climbs like a devil and dives like a stone. Its armament is heavy, and its armor makes it invulnerable to light fire. The laughter that once filled their briefings had vanished. By 1944, the Corsair's reputation had solidified. It was no longer the clumsy oddity mocked by its enemies. It was the air superiority fighter of the Pacific. Pilots began to take pride in flying it, mastering its quirks and pushing it beyond its design limits. They flew low-level strafing runs against Japanese positions, tore apart enemy bombers, and dominated every sky they entered. The same aircraft once considered unfit for carriers was now sinking ships, clearing airspace, and reshaping the outcome of the war. The transformation of the Corsair wasn't just mechanical, it was symbolic. It embodied the American ability to adapt, refine, and overcome. The early mockery from both friend and foe only made its eventual dominance more poetic. The gull-winged fighter that everyone laughed at had become the bird of prey that no one could escape. The Corsair's emergence as a dominant fighter was not an overnight transformation. Behind every victory in the sky were months of engineering revisions, endless pilot training, and countless sacrifices. When the Marines first began flying the Corsair, they faced the grim reality that even the most advanced machine was only as effective as the men who flew it. The early models, particularly the F4U, were temperamental and prone to mechanical issues. Hydraulic leaks, unpredictable stall behavior, and landing gear failures were common. Many pilots described it as a fighter that wanted to kill you before you even met the enemy. But those who survived their first few flights learned how to make the Corsair obey, and once mastered, it became a devastating weapon. Marine squadrons like VMF-124 and VMF-214, better known later as the Black Sheep Squadron, began testing the Corsair in real combat. Their experiences would shape the fighter's reputation. On February 14, 1943, Corsairs went into combat for the first time over Guadalcanal. The result was eye-opening. Despite being outnumbered, they downed several Japanese aircraft without losing a single plane. The Marines were ecstatic. For the first time in the war, American pilots had a machine that could truly take the fight to the Japanese, rather than just defend against them. Still, the Corsair was not perfect. The Navy's decision to sideline it for carrier operations remained in effect through much of 1943. That meant the aircraft operated primarily from rough island airstrips, often carved out of jungle or coral. Conditions were harsh. The heat, humidity, and constant enemy bombardments tested both the planes and their crews. Ground personnel had to improvise maintenance procedures, often using spare parts scavenged from wrecked aircraft. But the Corsair's robust construction allowed it to endure where lighter aircraft might have failed. Its double Wasp engine could take punishment, and its airframe absorbed damage that would have torn the Zero apart. As pilots adapted, so did their tactics. The key was to exploit the Corsair's strengths: speed, climb rate, and diving ability. Dogfighting with the Zero on its own terms was suicide. The Japanese fighter could turn inside nearly anything in the sky. But the Zero's Achilles heel was its fragility. A single hit to the fuel tank or engine could destroy it instantly. The Corsair's strategy was to strike hard, then disengage before the Zero could respond. It became a game of altitude and momentum. The Corsair ruled the vertical dimension of combat. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was profound. For years, they had been accustomed to dominating every encounter. The arrival of the Corsair changed that dynamic almost overnight. Suddenly, their tried-and-true tactics, tight turns, sudden climbs, surprise attacks from above, no longer worked. The Corsair's sheer speed allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement. If a Japanese pilot tried to pursue, the Corsair could simply dive away and vanish. If the Japanese tried to flee, the Corsair would catch them with ease. It was a new era of aerial warfare, one where raw power began to outmatch finesse. The transformation was most evident in the hands of exceptional pilots like Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. A seasoned veteran and a charismatic leader, Boyington formed VMF 214, a squadron of misfits, daredevils, and relentless fighters. They called themselves the Black Sheep, a nod to their unconventional nature and rough beginnings. But under Boyington's command, they became legends. Flying their Corsairs from island bases, they racked up victory after victory. Boyington himself claimed 28 aerial kills, making him one of the top American aces of the Pacific War. To the Japanese, his name became a symbol of death from above. Boyington's leadership style was as fierce as his flying. He drilled his men hard, demanding discipline and precision. He taught them to trust the Corsair's strengths, to use its speed and durability as weapons. When a pilot complained about the plane's quirks, Boyington would simply reply, "Learn it, love it, and let it do the killing." Under his command, the Black Sheep Squadron's Corsairs painted the skies of the South Pacific with fire and smoke. Japanese pilots soon learned to recognize the silhouette of the gull-winged fighter and to fear it. By mid-1944, the Corsair's kill-to-loss ratio was astonishing. For every Corsair shot down, dozens of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Reports from the front spoke of entire formations of Zeros being wiped out in minutes. The U.S. military began to realize that they had created not just a capable aircraft, but a war winner. The Navy took notice and began revisiting its earlier decision. Engineers worked tirelessly to modify the Corsair for carrier use. They lengthened the landing gear struts, added better shock absorbers, and improved visibility from the cockpit. By late 1944, the Corsair was finally cleared for full carrier operations. The same plane once banned from the decks of ships now became a cornerstone of naval aviation. As more squadrons received the Corsair, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted decisively. The Japanese Navy, already weakened by mounting losses, found its once invincible air arm decimated. The combination of Corsairs, Hellcats, and American carrier groups overwhelmed Japan's remaining pilots. Experienced aces were gone, replaced by hastily trained recruits who stood little chance against the veteran Corsair pilots. Many never returned from their first missions. For the Japanese, the Corsair represented an evolution in warfare they could no longer match. Their industry, crippled by shortages of materials and fuel, couldn't produce a competitive successor to the Zero in time. Aircraft like the N1K2J Shiden and the Ki-84 Hayate showed promise but were too few and too late. Meanwhile, Corsair production soared. Over 12,000 units would eventually roll off assembly lines, each one an improvement over the last. Variants like the F4U 1D and F4U 4 introduced even more power and better armament, further widening the gap. On the ground, Marines began to depend on Corsairs not just for air superiority but for close air support. The aircraft's rugged frame allowed it to dive low and strike with precision. Equipped with bombs and rockets, it shredded Japanese positions, tanks, and fortifications. The roar of a Corsair overhead became a source of reassurance for American troops and terror for their enemies. Soldiers on both sides could recognize the distinctive whine of its engine from miles away. To the Japanese, that sound meant death was coming fast. As the Corsair spread across the Pacific theater, its legend grew. From Bougainville to Okinawa, it became synonymous with dominance. Japanese reports increasingly referred to it with fear and frustration. One captured pilot was quoted as saying, "The Americans have a blue devil that comes from nowhere. It strikes once, and you are gone." That sentiment summed up the changing reality of the war. The Corsair had destroyed the myth of Japanese air invincibility. The irony was almost poetic. The same aircraft that had been mocked, sidelined, and nearly abandoned had become the instrument of Japan's downfall in the air. Every battle it fought, every Zero it sent plummeting into the sea, was a testament to perseverance, to the idea that even flawed beginnings can produce greatness. By 1945, the Corsair was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol, a mechanical embodiment of America's comeback in the Pacific. The Corsair's emergence as a dominant fighter was not an overnight transformation. Behind every victory in the sky were months of engineering revisions, endless pilot training, and countless sacrifices. When the Marines first began flying the Corsair, they faced the grim reality that even the most advanced machine was only as effective as the men who flew it. The early models, particularly the F4U-1, were temperamental and prone to mechanical issues. Hydraulic leaks, unpredictable stall behavior, and landing gear failures were common. Many pilots described it as a fighter that wanted to kill you before you even met the enemy. But those who survived their first few flights learned how to make the Corsair obey, and once mastered, it became a devastating weapon. Marine squadrons like VMF-124 and VMF-214, better known later as the Black Sheep Squadron, began testing the Corsair in real combat. Their experiences would shape the fighter's reputation. On February 14, 1943, Corsairs went into combat for the first time over Guadalcanal. The result was eye-opening. Despite being outnumbered, they downed several Japanese aircraft without losing a single plane. The Marines were ecstatic. For the first time in the war, American pilots had a machine that could truly take the fight to the Japanese, rather than just defend against them. Still, the Corsair was not perfect. The Navy's decision to sideline it for carrier operations remained in effect through much of 1943. That meant the aircraft operated primarily from rough island airstrips, often carved out of jungle or coral. Conditions were harsh. The heat, humidity, and constant enemy bombardments tested both the planes and their crews. Ground personnel had to improvise maintenance procedures, often using spare parts scavenged from wrecked aircraft. But the Corsair's robust construction allowed it to endure where lighter aircraft might have failed. Its double Wasp engine could take punishment, and its airframe absorbed damage that would have torn the Zero apart. As pilots adapted, so did their tactics. The key was to exploit the Corsair's strengths, speed, climb rate, and diving ability. Dogfighting with the Zero on its own terms was suicide. The Japanese fighter could turn inside nearly anything in the sky. But the Zero's Achilles heel was its fragility. A single hit to the fuel tank or engine could destroy it instantly. The Corsair's strategy was to strike hard, then disengage before the Zero could respond. It became a game of altitude and momentum. The Corsair ruled the vertical dimension of combat. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was profound. For years, they had been accustomed to dominating every encounter. The arrival of the Corsair changed that dynamic almost overnight. Suddenly, their tried-and-true tactics, tight turns, sudden climbs, surprise attacks from above, no longer worked. The Corsair's sheer speed allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement. If a Japanese pilot tried to pursue, the Corsair could simply dive away and vanish. If the Japanese tried to flee, the Corsair would catch them with ease. It was a new era of aerial warfare, one where raw power began to outmatch finesse. The transformation was most evident in the hands of exceptional pilots like Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a seasoned veteran and a charismatic leader. Boyington formed VMF-214, a squadron of misfits, daredevils, and relentless fighters. They called themselves the Black Sheep, a nod to their unconventional nature and rough beginnings. But under Boyington's command, they became legends. Flying their Corsairs from island bases, they racked up victory after victory. Boyington himself claimed 28 aerial kills, making him one of the top American aces of the Pacific War. To the Japanese, his name became a symbol of death from above. Boyington's leadership style was as fierce as his flying. He drilled his men hard, demanding discipline and precision. He taught them to trust the Corsair's strengths, to use its speed and durability as weapons. When a pilot complained about the plane's quirks, Boyington would simply reply, "Learn it, love it, and let it do the killing." Under his command, the Black Sheep Squadron's Corsairs painted the skies of the South Pacific with fire and smoke. Japanese pilots soon learned to recognize the silhouette of the gull-winged fighter and to fear it. By mid-1944, the Corsair's kill-to-loss ratio was astonishing. For every Corsair shot down, dozens of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Reports from the front spoke of entire formations of Zeros being wiped out in minutes. The U.S. military began to realize that they had created not just a capable aircraft, but a war winner. The Navy took notice and began revisiting its earlier decision. Engineers worked tirelessly to modify the Corsair for carrier use. They lengthened the landing gear struts, added better shock absorbers, and improved visibility from the cockpit. By late 1944, the Corsair was finally cleared for full carrier operations. The same plane once banned from the decks of ships now became a cornerstone of naval aviation. As more squadrons received the Corsair, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted decisively. The Japanese Navy, already weakened by mounting losses, found its once invincible air arm decimated. The combination of Corsairs, Hellcats, and American carrier groups overwhelmed Japan's remaining pilots. Experienced aces were gone, replaced by hastily trained recruits who stood little chance against the veteran Corsair pilots. Many never returned from their first missions. For the Japanese, the Corsair represented an evolution in warfare they could no longer match. Their industry, crippled by shortages of materials and fuel, couldn't produce a competitive successor to the Zero in time. Aircraft like the N1K2J Shitten and the Kai-84 Hayate showed promise but were too few and too late. Meanwhile, Corsair production soared. Over 12,000 units would eventually roll off assembly lines, each one an improvement over the last. Variants like the F4U-1D and F4U-4 introduced even more power and better armament, further widening the gap. On the ground, Marines began to depend on Corsairs not just for air superiority, but for close air support. The aircraft's rugged frame allowed it to dive low and strike with precision. Equipped with bombs and rockets, it shredded Japanese positions, tanks, and fortifications. The roar of a Corsair overhead became a source of reassurance for American troops and terror for their enemies. Soldiers on both sides could recognize the distinctive whine of its engine from miles away. To the Japanese, that sound meant death was coming fast. As the Corsair spread across the Pacific theater, its legend grew. From Bougainville to Okinawa, it became synonymous with dominance. Japanese reports increasingly referred to it with fear and frustration. One captured pilot was quoted as saying, "The Americans have a blue devil that comes from nowhere. It strikes once, and you are gone." That sentiment summed up the changing reality of the war. The Corsair had destroyed the myth of Japanese air invincibility. The irony was almost poetic. The same aircraft that had been mocked, sidelined, and nearly abandoned had become the instrument of Japan's downfall in the air. Every battle it fought, every Zero it sent plummeting into the sea, was a testament to perseverance, to the idea that even flawed beginnings can produce greatness. By 1945, the Corsair was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol, a mechanical embodiment of America's comeback in the Pacific. That's part 2, 2,000 words total so far. Would you like me to continue with the next 1,000 words, part 3? You said yes. ChatGPT said, perfect, here's the next 1,000 words, part 3, continuing the story seamlessly. The year 1944 marked the beginning of the Corsair's true reign. With every month that passed, the Japanese found themselves increasingly on the defensive, their once proud air wings crumbling against the relentless tide of American fighters. The Corsair's introduction to carrier decks had amplified its reach. Now, it wasn't limited to island bases. It could take off from the vast armadas sweeping across the Pacific. The aircraft that had once been called unfit for naval operations was now taking off from flat tops with stunning regularity, leading bombing runs, intercept missions, and escort duties. Pilots who had once struggled with its quirks now spoke of it with pride and reverence. The hose nose had become a mark of fearlessness and skill. From the decks of carriers like the USS Bunker Hill and USS Essex, squadrons of Corsairs roared into the sky with their distinctive blue paint glinting under the tropical sun. The Japanese, desperate to defend their remaining strongholds, threw everything they had into the air: Zeros, Tonys, Franks, and even kamikaze pilots. But none could stop the tide. The Corsair, armed with 6 deadly .50 caliber machine guns and often supplemented with rockets or bombs, dominated not just air-to-air combat, but ground attack missions as well. Japanese convoys, radar stations, and airfields were pounded mercilessly. The tables had turned completely. Corsair pilots had a swagger that came from confidence, not arrogance, but a deep, hard-earned trust in their aircraft. Many of them remembered the early days when the Japanese mocked American machines as clumsy and crude. Now, it was the Corsair's victims who found themselves outclassed in every category that mattered. The Zero could still outturn it, but that advantage no longer meant much when the Corsair refused to play the turning game. Dogfights were no longer elegant dances in the sky. They were brutal, decisive, and deadly. The Corsair would strike from above, unleash a storm of bullets, and vanish in a dive that no Japanese plane could follow. The aircraft's durability became legendary. Pilots returned from missions with bullet holes in their wings, damaged landing gear, and shredded control surfaces. Yet the Corsair brought them home. The R-2800 engine could take tremendous punishment and still keep running. Its self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the fiery deaths that had claimed so many Zero pilots. Stories circulated among Marines of Corsairs limping back to base with missing cylinders, half a tail, or a wing peppered with shrapnel. These tales weren't exaggerations. The Corsair was built like a tank that happened to fly like a bullet. As the war pushed closer to Japan's home islands, the Corsair's role expanded. It became the primary escort for bombers targeting Japanese infrastructure. The B-25s and B-24s that once faced deadly resistance now had Corsairs by their side, carving through enemy interceptors before they could get close. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners began to dread the whine of the Corsair's engine almost as much as the bombers themselves. On low-level missions, the Corsair's ability to deliver rockets and 1,000-pound bombs made it an airborne artillery piece. Villages, airstrips, and supply depots were obliterated under its fire. In the spring of 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, further demonstrated Japan's collapsing air power. While Hellcats handled much of the carrier-based combat, Corsairs supported operations from land bases, intercepting Japanese bombers and strafing retreating forces. The results were devastating. Japan lost over 600 aircraft in just 2 days, many destroyed before they even reached the American fleet. The once mighty Imperial Navy Air Service had been effectively broken. The Corsair, alongside its stablemates, ensured that Japan would never regain control of the skies. But the story of the Corsair wasn't just written by statistics or battle reports. It was written in the hearts of those who flew it. Marine pilots described the sensation of flight in the Corsair as unlike any other: the raw acceleration, the roar of the engine, the feeling of invincibility that came when the gull-winged shadow passed over the clouds. "She's got a mean streak," one pilot said, "but if you treat her right, she'll bring you back every time." The Corsair was more than a tool. It was a companion, a living, breathing machine that demanded respect and rewarded courage. Even as the Japanese military tried to adapt, they could not match the Corsair's combination of technology and tactics. Their new fighters, like the Nakajima Ki-84 and Kawanishi N-1K, were formidable on paper, but fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and limited production made them rare sights. The Corsair, by contrast, was rolling off American production lines in staggering numbers. Vought couldn't keep up with demand, so other companies, Goodyear and Brewster, began producing them under license. The result was a steady flood of Corsairs pouring into the Pacific. No matter how many Japan managed to shoot down, 10 more seemed to appear in their place. By late 1944, even Japanese ground troops recognized the Corsair as a symbol of impending doom. It wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was the herald of destruction. When Marines advanced on an island, Corsairs cleared the skies, destroyed artillery, and strafed enemy trenches. Their presence meant that resistance would soon be crushed from above. One Japanese soldier captured during the campaign on Peleliu reportedly said, "When the blue gull comes, there is no hope." To the Americans, the Corsair represented salvation. To the Japanese, it represented the end. As the war approached its climax, the Corsair's dominance was absolute. The U.S. Navy's carrier task forces moved freely across the Pacific, striking targets deep within Japanese territory. The enemy's once proud airfields now lay in ruins, littered with the charred remains of aircraft that never stood a chance. The laughter that had greeted the Corsair's debut had turned into silence, the kind that only follows devastation. Even Japan's most elite pilots, the ones who had survived years of combat, could do little but watch helplessly as their skies filled with the aircraft they had once mocked. Perhaps the most striking transformation was in the minds of the Corsair's pilots themselves. They knew what the plane had been: a problem child, a killer of its own rookies, a rejected design. They had read the reports, heard the complaints, and seen the wrecks. But now they were flying the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Every sortie felt like redemption. The same gull wings that once drew laughter were now symbols of power and retribution. In the closing months of 1944, the Corsair wasn't just winning battles, it was erasing the memory of America's early defeats. The war that had started with humiliation at Pearl Harbor was now being fought and won on America's terms. In every theater it flew, the Corsair left an impression. It was fast enough to chase down bombers, tough enough to take on ground fire, and agile enough to handle dogfights when necessary. It blurred the line between air superiority fighter and strike aircraft, embodying the flexibility that would define post-war aviation. And as it tore through the clouds, the Japanese could only watch as the sky, once their domain, was now ruled by the very machine they had laughed at. By early 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard for Japanese air power. The skies, once filled with Zeros and bombers, now belonged to the Corsair and its American counterparts. Every major island assault, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Luzon, saw Corsairs in the vanguard, their engines roaring over beaches and jungles. They strafed landing zones ahead of amphibious assaults, destroyed anti-aircraft positions, and patrolled the skies relentlessly. The plane that had been ridiculed for its strange looks had become the very embodiment of dominance. The gull-wing silhouette that once invited laughter now evoked dread in anyone unlucky enough to see it overhead. On the ground, Marines and soldiers developed a deep respect for the aircraft. Its pilots, often young men barely in their 20s, became local heroes at every forward base. When Corsairs thundered low over enemy positions, the troops below would cheer. They knew that death was raining down on the enemy. The Japanese, meanwhile, could only hide and pray. The Corsair's attacks were merciless. Its rockets could obliterate tanks and bunkers, and its machine guns could turn entire trenches into chaos. It was not just an airplane anymore. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. The Japanese command recognized the threat. Reports sent back to Tokyo detailed the growing nightmare. Their pilots complained that the new American fighter was unbeatable in a dive, impossible to shake once it was on their tail, and resilient beyond reason. "Even when struck, it continues to fight," one pilot wrote grimly. "Our bullets do nothing. It is as though the Americans have armored the sky itself." The Corsair's reputation grew to mythical proportions. The Japanese even assigned new code names to American aircraft. The Corsair was called Whistling Death in many reports, and not just as a nickname. It was a warning. As the Allies closed in on Okinawa in April 1945, the Corsair was at the center of the largest aerial campaign of the Pacific War. The Japanese unleashed a desperate wave of kamikaze attacks, hoping to stall the inevitable. For the Americans, the Corsair became one of the most crucial defenses against these suicide pilots. Its speed allowed it to intercept incoming kamikazes long before they reached the fleet. In one harrowing day, Corsairs from carrier groups around Okinawa shot down dozens of enemy aircraft before they could strike their targets. The pilots flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire, knowing that if they missed even one kamikaze, hundreds of sailors could die. It was perhaps the most dangerous duty of the war, and the Corsair carried it out with ruthless efficiency. For many Japanese pilots, the kamikaze missions were a tragic symbol of the war's end. They knew they could not match the Americans technologically or numerically. They had gone from laughing at American designs to throwing their lives away against them. The Corsair represented everything Japan could no longer achieve: speed, strength, and overwhelming industrial might. The skies, once a place of Japanese glory, were now their tomb. At sea, Corsairs launched from carriers as part of the Great Task Force 58, striking deep into the Japanese mainland. They attacked airfields, railways, and supply depots across Kyushu and Honshu. The devastation was immense. The Corsair had evolved far beyond its original purpose as a fighter. It was now a multi-role powerhouse, escorting bombers, providing close air support, and even engaging ships. Its versatility made it indispensable, and its design proved ahead of its time. Long after other aircraft had faded, the Corsair was still improving, still fighting, still redefining what a propeller-driven warplane could do. Amid the chaos of these battles, stories of courage and tragedy unfolded every day. Pilots would return to their carriers with their planes riddled with bullet holes, landing gear damaged, and fuel tanks nearly dry. Some never made it back. Others crash-landed on beaches or in the ocean, surviving only by luck and determination. The bond between pilot and aircraft grew almost spiritual. Many described the Corsair as having a personality: stubborn, powerful, loyal. It demanded respect, and those who gave it that respect found it willing to take them through hell and bring them home again. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Corsair's war was far from over. In just 3 years, it had transformed from an experimental misfit into one of the most feared aircraft ever built. Its pilots had achieved some of the highest kill ratios in history, with many Corsair units boasting 11-to-1 or even higher kill-to-loss records. The laughter that had once followed the plane's debut had turned into stunned silence. Japanese pilots who survived the war often spoke of the Corsair with reluctant admiration. One veteran said, "When we saw that shape in the sky, we knew the battle was lost. It was like fighting a storm." The Corsair's success wasn't just a matter of design. It was a reflection of innovation under pressure. Every problem it faced had been solved not by abandoning it, but by improving it. Engineers refined the landing gear, adjusted the cockpit, and streamlined its systems. Each new version was stronger, faster, and more reliable than the last. The F4U variant, which appeared near the end of the war, was capable of speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest propeller-driven fighters ever built. For a machine that had once been dismissed as a failure, its evolution was nothing short of miraculous. As peace settled over the Pacific, many Corsairs were retired or placed in reserve, but their story didn't end there. In 1950, when war erupted again on the Korean peninsula, the Corsair returned to the skies. This time, it wasn't dueling Agile Zeros, it was supporting troops on the ground against communist forces. The same ruggedness that had made it feared in World War II made it invaluable in Korea. It bombed bridges, strafed convoys, and delivered close air support in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Even in an era of jet aircraft, the Corsair held its own. For the Japanese, the Corsair's legacy remained etched in memory. It was the plane that symbolized the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when laughter turned into despair. In the years that followed, many former Japanese aviators admitted that they had underestimated American engineering. The Corsair, with its awkward shape and unconventional design, had been easy to mock but impossible to defeat. It had proved that innovation wasn't always elegant. Sometimes it was brutal, raw, and unstoppable. The irony of history is that the Corsair's greatest strength lay in what others perceived as its flaws. Its long nose, once derided for obscuring the pilot's vision, housed an engine so powerful that it could outfly anything the Japanese had. Its bent wings, a design compromise, gave it the clearance needed for a massive propeller that turned it into a force of nature. Every part of the Corsair that once drew ridicule became part of its legend. The laughter that greeted it in 1942 had long since faded into the wind, replaced by the haunting whistle that echoed through the Pacific skies. When veterans of both sides spoke of the war years later, they often recalled the Corsair with awe. For the Americans, it was a symbol of redemption. For the Japanese, it was a reminder of the day their skies fell silent. And for the world, it was proof that even the strangest, most doubted ideas could rise to greatness. The gull-winged bird that no one believed in had changed the course of history. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Corsair stood as one of the enduring icons of the Pacific War. It had flown more than 64,000 combat sorties, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, and earned a reputation that even its most ardent critics could not deny. But its story didn't end with Japan's surrender. If anything, the post-war years only deepened its legend. The aircraft's combination of speed, strength, and versatility ensured that it would remain in service long after other piston-driven fighters were retired. And in that extended lifespan, it continued to prove why it had been the bane of the Japanese Empire. The transition from war to peace brought reflection among those who had witnessed the Corsair's rise. Engineers at REWROTE, once uncertain of their creation's future, now saw it as a triumph of perseverance. Pilots who had flown through fire and chaos remembered their Corsairs with affection that bordered on reverence. Many described it as a machine that saved their lives more times than they could count. One Marine veteran later said, "When the bullets started flying, the Corsair was like a steel angel. You didn't pray for luck, you trusted the plane." In Japan, surviving pilots reflected on how thoroughly the Corsair had altered their fortunes. They remembered the first time they'd seen it, that strange, gull-winged silhouette cutting through the sky. They had laughed, confident that no American machine could rival their Zeros. But by the war's end, that laughter had been replaced by a kind of haunted respect. They knew now that the Corsair had changed everything. The American pilots who flew it were not necessarily better, but they had an aircraft that erased the advantages Japan once held. The balance of technology had shifted, and with it, the fate of empires. For the U.S. military, the Corsair became a cornerstone of post-war aviation. It was too good to discard, too capable to be replaced immediately. In 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, the Corsair returned to combat in the Korean War, nearly a decade after its first flight. Jet aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 now dominated the skies, but the Corsair found a new purpose in ground attack. Its ability to carry bombs and rockets made it invaluable in supporting UN troops on the front lines. Corsairs flew from both carriers and land bases, enduring anti-aircraft fire and punishing weather to deliver their payloads with deadly precision. For young pilots in Korea, flying the Corsair was like stepping into history. They knew they were piloting a legend, the same machine that had ruled the skies over the Pacific. Despite its age, it performed with the same ferocity it always had. In many cases, its slower speed compared to jets was actually an advantage in close air support missions, allowing pilots to loiter longer and hit targets with greater accuracy. The aircraft's ruggedness once again proved essential. Pilots returned to their carriers with wings riddled with holes and engines leaking oil, yet the Corsair kept flying. Its reputation as an indestructible workhorse only grew. Back home, the Corsair captured the imagination of the public. It became the centerpiece of air shows, movies, and television series. None was more famous than Ba Ba Black Sheep, a show inspired by Pappy Boyington's real-life exploits with VMF 214. Through such portrayals, the Corsair became more than a weapon of war. It became a symbol of American grit and innovation. Children built model Corsairs, air museums displayed them proudly, and veterans gathered around their surviving machines like old friends. The bent-wing bird had taken its place among the immortals. Yet, beyond the nostalgia and heroism, the Corsair's story offered deeper lessons about war, technology, and perception. When it first appeared, its unorthodox design made it a target of ridicule, not just from enemies but even within the U.S. military. The Navy's rejection of it for carrier use had been a blow to Vought's engineers, and yet, by refusing to give up, they proved that innovation often hides behind what looks like failure. Every line of the Corsair's design, from its gull wings to its massive engine, served a purpose that would only become clear in combat. The very features that once drew laughter became the reasons for its success. In that sense, the Corsair's rise mirrored the story of the United States in World War II. In the early years, America had been underestimated, dismissed as unprepared and soft. Japan believed it could win through speed, surprise, and discipline. But as the war dragged on, the United States' capacity for adaptation and reinvention became unstoppable. The Corsair, born of setbacks and perfected through trial, embodied that spirit. It was proof that resilience could triumph over elegance, and that the underdog could not only survive, but dominate. Pilots from the Black Sheep Squadron carried that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. They had started as outcasts, flying a rejected plane, and ended up rewriting history. Pappy Boyington's leadership, reckless, brilliant, and unyielding, had forged them into one of the most effective combat units of the war. Their Corsairs became extensions of their willpower, machines that channeled their defiance into victory. Long after the war, Boyington himself said in an interview, "They called it the Ensign Eliminator, but it eliminated a lot more of the enemy than it ever did us. That's what matters." While the Corsair's triumphs were celebrated, its human cost was never forgotten. Many who flew it never returned. The Pacific War had been brutal beyond imagination, and the skies above it were no less deadly. Every victory came at a price, every mission a gamble. But the men who flew the Corsair accepted those risks willingly. They trusted their plane, not because it was perfect, but because it was dependable. It could take punishment, it could fight back, and it could bring them home. In war, that was all a pilot could ask for. As the decades passed, the Corsair gradually faded from active service, replaced by the jet age's faster, sleeker machines. Yet, even as new generations of aircraft took to the skies, the Corsair's legend never dimmed. Its deep blue paint and gull wings remained instantly recognizable, its silhouette a reminder of a time when courage and craftsmanship decided the fate of nations. At air shows around the world, restored Corsairs still fly today, their engines growling just as they did over the Pacific. Spectators look up, see that distinctive shape, and hear the echo of history, the whistle of whistling death. For Japan, the Corsair became a ghost that lingered in memory. In post-war interviews, former Japanese pilots spoke candidly about the fear it inspired. One veteran recalled, "We used to joke that we could hear the Corsair's whistle before we saw it. When that sound came, you knew it was over." The irony wasn't lost on them. The machine they had mocked had become their executioner in the skies. Yet many also expressed admiration for its pilots, acknowledging the skill and bravery it took to fly such a powerful aircraft into battle day after day. Time transformed that mutual respect into something profound. In later years, American and Japanese veterans met at reunions, shaking hands and sharing stories. They spoke not as enemies, but as men bound by the same sky, men who had seen death, courage, and redemption up close. And often the Corsair found its way into those conversations. It had been the weapon that divided them, but also the symbol that brought them together in understanding. The laughter that had once echoed in Japanese hangars had turned into quiet remembrance, a recognition of how far both sides had come. As the post-war years unfolded, the legend of the Corsair only grew stronger. The aircraft was more than a relic of a bygone era. It became a living link between generations of aviators. At airbases, museums, and veterans gatherings, the stories surrounding it were told and retold, each time with new reverence. Young pilots would stand beside the weathered veterans who had flown them in combat, gazing at the blue wings and imagining what it must have been like to command such a beast. The veterans would often smile knowingly. They knew that no words could fully describe what it meant to fly a Corsair in war. It was something that had to be felt. The vibration of the engine, the weight of the stick, the thunder of the guns, the sudden silence when a foe disappeared in a plume of smoke. The Corsair's enduring fame was not built solely on its victories, but on its transformation. It was an aircraft that had defied expectation at every stage of its life. When it was first introduced, the world saw a flawed experiment, an over-engineered machine that looked more like a dare than a design. The Navy's decision to ground it from carrier operations could have ended its story right there. But instead, the Marines took a chance, and that chance changed history. By the end of the war, the Corsair was the Navy's most successful fighter, a record that no one could have predicted when it first stumbled onto the flight deck years earlier. In the Pacific, the Japanese never truly developed an answer to it. Their engineers worked tirelessly to create newer, faster, better-armed planes. The Kawanishi N1K2, George, the Nakajima Ki-84, Frank, the Mitsubishi J2M, Raiden. But these aircraft never arrived in numbers sufficient to make a difference. Japan's manufacturing base was crumbling, its resources depleted, and its experienced pilots nearly gone. By 1945, most of their young aviators had only a few dozen hours of flight training before being thrown into combat. Against the Corsair, that was suicide. The aircraft's pilots were by then experts, their tactics honed, their confidence unshakable. The outcome of each encounter was almost preordained, and yet the Japanese spirit of determination never waned. Even as the Corsair dominated the skies, many Japanese pilots went up knowing they would not return. Some took to the air in outdated aircraft, others in newly built fighters without proper fuel or ammunition. They faced impossible odds, and still they went. For many of them, their last view of the world was of that unmistakable silhouette, the bent wings glinting in the sun, diving toward them with terrifying precision. The Corsair didn't just destroy aircraft, it shattered illusions. It was proof that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, that the empire which once ruled the Pacific was now on the brink of collapse. For the Americans, the Corsair symbolized victory through innovation. It wasn't just another machine of war, it was a manifestation of problem-solving under pressure. Every feature that had once seemed strange was a solution to a specific challenge. The bent wings solved the propeller clearance issue while keeping the landing gear strong. The massive engine gave it the power to dominate the air. Even its long nose, so often mocked, was the reason it could house that much horsepower. Each imperfection was a key to its perfection. The Corsair's story became a lesson in engineering humility. Never judge a design by its appearance, and never give up on something because it's difficult. The American pilots who flew the Corsair shared a special bond with their aircraft. They often spoke of it as if it were alive, a creature of metal and fury that shared their fate. Some pilots described how they would pat the fuselage before takeoff, whispering a promise, "Let's get home together." In return, the Corsair delivered. Its resilience was unmatched. Pilots returned from missions with half their control surfaces gone, oil leaking from the engine and bullet holes in every direction, yet somehow the plane stayed aloft. Engineers at Vaut would later study some of these battle-damaged Corsairs in disbelief, unable to understand how they had remained airworthy. It was as though the machine itself refused to die. That spirit of survival carried into Korea. The Corsair's role there was different, but no less vital. It became a terror to ground forces, raining bombs and rockets on enemy positions in rugged terrain. In one famous mission, a Corsair pilot named Thomas Hudner crash-landed his plane in the snow to try and save his wingman, Jesse Brown, who had been shot down behind enemy lines. Brown was the Navy's first black carrier pilot, and Hudner's act of heroism, risking his own life to rescue a friend, captured the enduring brotherhood of Corsair pilots. The aircraft they flew demanded courage, but it also inspired it. Even after the Korean War ended, the Corsair refused to fade quietly into history. Smaller nations continued to use it well into the 1960s. French forces flew Corsairs during the First Indochina War and later in Algeria, where they supported ground troops in colonial conflicts. Latin American air forces kept them in service even longer. In 1969, more than 2 decades after World War II, Corsairs flown by El Salvador and Honduras fought in what became known as the Soccer War. It was perhaps the last combat between piston-engine fighters in history, and the Corsair, true to its reputation, held its own even in that strange, distant conflict. Through all these years, the Corsair's image remained tied to its beginnings, the laughter of those who underestimated it, and the silence that followed when it proved them wrong. It had gone from being an object of ridicule to a symbol of unstoppable force. The Japanese pilots who once scoffed at it had learned its power the hard way, their arrogance giving way to awe. They had faced the Corsair and discovered that beneath its ungainly frame lay a predator without mercy. Looking back, it is impossible to separate the Corsair from the human story that surrounded it. It was not just a machine of metal and rivets. It was the sum of thousands of human decisions, sacrifices, and acts of courage. It was the engineers who refused to abandon their design when it failed its first carrier tests. It was the mechanics who worked through nights repairing shot-up aircraft with whatever parts they could find. It was the pilots who risked everything to master its unpredictable temperament. And it was the enemies who, through their laughter and disbelief, helped define its legacy. Without that mockery, the story would lose its poetry. The tale of a plane that was laughed at until it owned the sky. Even decades later, that irony continued to fascinate historians and aviation enthusiasts. The Corsair became a metaphor for resilience itself. Its evolution from outcast to icon mirrored the very essence of human determination. The belief that flaws can become strengths, that failure is only temporary, and that greatness often wears an unfamiliar face. Those lessons outlasted the war, echoing far beyond the airfields of the Pacific. For Japan, too, the Corsair's legacy had meaning. In the years after the war, the country rebuilt its aviation industry with a newfound respect for engineering excellence and innovation. Many of the same minds that once built the Zero would later help create the technological powerhouse that Japan became in the 20th century. The laughter that had greeted the Corsair had been silenced, but in that silence, lessons had taken root. Lessons about humility, adaptation, and progress. In a way, the Corsair had not only conquered Japan's skies, but helped shape its post-war soul. The Corsair's transformation from outcast to legend was more than just a story of technology. It was a testament to human will. In 1940, when REWROTE engineers first drew up the blueprints, few could have predicted how profoundly this aircraft would alter the air war in the Pacific. The United States was still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, scrambling to modernize its forces and desperate to catch up with the Japanese, who had spent the previous decade perfecting their military aviation. The Zero, agile and elegant, seemed to embody everything American aircraft were not. Then came the Corsair, a machine that looked nothing like the sleek Japanese fighters, a plane that seemed to defy the very idea of beauty in design. But as the war would prove, beauty had little to do with survival. The Corsair was never meant to be graceful, it was meant to be dominant. Its massive engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, produced over 2,000 horsepower, an unheard-of figure for its time. That power came at a cost, a long, heavy nose that obscured the pilot's view during landings and takeoffs. But once airborne, it was like nothing else in the sky. It could climb like a rocket, dive faster than any Japanese aircraft, and accelerate with brutal force. The first time a test pilot opened the throttle fully, the Corsair leaped forward so violently that it startled everyone watching. It wasn't just fast, it was feral. Still, that raw power came with challenges. Pilots had to learn to handle its torque, its tendency to roll violently on takeoff, and its unpredictable stall characteristics. In inexperienced hands, it was a killer. The Ensign Eliminator nickname wasn't just a joke, it was a warning. Dozens of young pilots wrecked Corsairs in training before they ever saw combat. But those who mastered it gained something few aircraft could offer: complete control of the battle. Once a pilot understood its rhythms, the Corsair became an extension of his instincts. It could outclimb, outgun, and outlast anything Japan could send into the air. In Japan, intelligence officers initially dismissed reports of the Corsair as exaggerated. American propaganda, they thought, was trying to cover for its earlier losses. The idea that the U.S. could produce a fighter superior to the Zero seemed absurd, but as wreckage began to tell the truth, battered Corsair parts recovered from crash sites, gun camera footage showing American pilots shredding Japanese formations, the disbelief began to fade. The Japanese high command realized too late that a new kind of war had arrived, one their aircraft and pilots were not prepared to fight. The Zero's advantages, lightweight, agility, and range, had made it formidable early in the war. But those same features became weaknesses against an opponent like the Corsair. The Japanese fighter lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few 50-caliber rounds could set it ablaze. Its airframe, built for maneuverability, couldn't withstand steep dives or high-speed maneuvers. In contrast, the Corsair was built to absorb punishment. It was heavier, sturdier, and far more powerful. The American pilots learned quickly not to engage in tight-turning dogfights where the Zero excelled. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving from high altitude, firing, and climbing away before the slower Zero could respond. It was a new form of air combat that favored speed and energy over finesse, and it was devastatingly effective. By 1943, Japanese pilots began to report a strange new sound in the skies, a high-pitched whistle carried by the wind long before the Corsair itself appeared. The sound came from the airflow through the aircraft's wing root intakes, a quirk of its design. But for those who heard it, it became a warning of death. The nickname Whistling Death was born not from American propaganda, but from the fear of the men who faced it. The sound meant that somewhere above, a Corsair was diving, and within seconds, someone would die. The shift in air dominance was dramatic. In the first years of the war, Japanese pilots had fought with confidence bordering on arrogance. They had trained under a system that prized precision and individual skill, and they saw their enemies as inferior. But the war's brutal attrition eroded that confidence. The Corsair, along with the Hellcat and improved American tactics, ensured that Japan's veteran pilots were gradually replaced by green recruits. The Americans, meanwhile, rotated their experienced aviators back home to train new ones. This difference in philosophy meant that while Japan's skill base evaporated, America's grew stronger with each passing month. In many ways, the Corsair represented this evolution of strategy. It wasn't just a tool for killing, it was a tool for learning. Every engagement was studied, every weakness improved upon. The Marines developed new formation tactics tailored to the Corsair's speed and firepower. They flew in pairs, using coordinated attacks to lure the Japanese into disadvantageous positions. The days of solo heroics were over. Air combat had become a science, and the Corsair was its instrument. The Japanese tried to adapt. They experimented with new tactics, including coordinated ambushes and cloud-based hit-and-run attacks. But these could not overcome the fundamental imbalance in speed and firepower. The Corsair pilots began to dominate the kill ratios, 5-1, 10-1, sometimes more. Japanese morale plummeted. It was like fighting ghosts, one surviving pilot later recalled. They came from above, and before you could even turn, they were gone. We fired at their shadows. For the Marines on the ground, the Corsair was more than a fighter. It was a guardian angel. On islands like Bougainville, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, they would hear that familiar whine above and know that help was coming. The Corsair's ability to dive bomb and strafe enemy positions made it indispensable in close support roles. Japanese troops learned to fear the sound of its guns as much as its engine. Those 6 Browning 50-caliber machine guns could unleash over 1,800 rounds per minute, turning entire jungle positions into rubble in seconds. The aircraft's blue silhouette became both a comfort and a terror, depending on which side of the barrel you were on. Behind all this success, the Corsair's pilots formed a fraternity of sorts, a group bound by their shared experiences and the machine that had carried them through. They painted their planes with names, nose art, and kill tallies, creating personal identities for the cold metal beasts they flew. To them, the Corsair wasn't just hardware, it was a living partner in survival. Every pilot had stories of near misses, of dogfights that felt like duels, of friends who didn't come back. Those stories became the heartbeat of the Corsair legend. Even the Japanese in defeat could not help but acknowledge the aircraft's place in history. Many post-war aviators studied its design, admiring the ingenuity that had produced such an unorthodox yet effective fighter. In interviews, some admitted that they had laughed when they first saw it, and regretted that laughter ever since. It was a bitter lesson in underestimation, one paid for with the lives of countless comrades. The Corsair's dominance wasn't just a victory of metal over metal, but of mindset over mindset. It proved that adaptability could defeat tradition, and that innovation often comes from embracing the strange, the unconventional, and the misunderstood. It was, in every sense, a weapon born from audacity, a design so bold that it was almost doomed to fail, yet so perfect in its imperfection that it changed the course of history. As the Pacific campaign intensified, the Corsair became more than a weapon. It became a message. Each time one took to the skies, it carried with it the embodiment of American industrial might and the unyielding determination of its pilots. For the Japanese, every encounter with it was a grim reminder that the tides of war had shifted irreversibly. The same pilots who had once scoffed at its ungainly frame now spoke of it in whispers, with the respect reserved for a formidable and inevitable adversary. They had watched the gull-winged monster rise from mockery to mastery, and by 1944, the laughter had turned to silence. In the Solomon Islands, the Corsair's legend deepened with each engagement. The Marine squadrons operating there became experts in the art of coordinated assault. They learned to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, to dive out of the sun, strike fast, and retreat before the Japanese could respond. The Zero's incredible agility was meaningless if it couldn't catch its opponent. The Corsair dictated the terms of battle, speed, altitude, and timing. This was a new era of air combat where maneuverability alone no longer guaranteed survival. Power had replaced grace. The Japanese pilots were not ignorant of their disadvantage. Many wrote home describing their frustration and despair. "Their new fighter comes from the clouds like thunder," one pilot lamented in a letter found after the war. "Its sound pierces the air, and then our planes are gone." That whistling roar, the sound that gave the Corsair its haunting nickname, was now etched into the collective memory of those who faced it. It was not just a mechanical noise, it was an omen, a prelude to destruction. The once proud airmen of the Imperial Navy now flew knowing that death could arrive unseen and unstoppable. The Corsair's success was not solely the result of its superior engineering. It was also the product of a new breed of pilot, bold, aggressive, and unafraid to challenge convention. Men like Gregory "Pappy" Boyington embodied that spirit. Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, became the stuff of legend, both feared and admired for their ferocity in combat. Boyington himself was larger than life, brash, brilliant, and often reckless. But in the cockpit of a Corsair, he was untouchable. Under his leadership, the Black Sheep shot down over 90 Japanese aircraft in just 84 days. Their exploits became headlines back home, turning the Corsair into a symbol of American defiance. Boyington's tactics were simple but deadly. He taught his pilots to fight smart, not just brave. Never turn with a zero, never lose altitude without purpose, and always attack from a position of advantage. His Corsairs would swoop down in coordinated bursts, hit their targets, and vanish before the enemy could recover. The results were devastating. Japanese formations that once moved with confident precision began to scatter at the first sign of the bent-wing fighter. They were being hunted now, and they knew it. But for every victory, there was loss. The Corsair may have been the deadliest plane in the Pacific, but it was still flown by mortal men. Many of those men never came home. Dogfights in the Pacific were vicious and personal. Pilots often saw the faces of their enemies as they exchanged fire, separated by only a few hundred feet. The skies were filled not with grand strategy, but with moments of raw instinct, life or death decided in seconds. When a Corsair went down, its comrades felt it deeply. Every loss was a reminder that mastery of the skies came at a terrible price. The Japanese Air Corps suffered even more. By late 1944, they were losing not just aircraft, but the lifeblood of their Air Force, trained pilots. The rigorous training programs that had produced Japan's early war aces were gone. There was no time, no fuel, and no resources. Young pilots, barely out of school, were rushed into cockpits and sent to face veterans flying machines that outperformed theirs in every way. The result was slaughter. The Corsair's pilots often described these encounters as tragic rather than triumphant. They knew the men they were shooting down were not fools, just outmatched. In their reports, many spoke of pity mixed with duty. Strange, somber respect for the courage of their opponents. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Corsair became a symbol of hope. Newsreels showed footage of it soaring through Pacific skies, the ultimate expression of American technological prowess. The public marveled at its speed and power, at how far the U.S. had come since the dark days of Pearl Harbor. Factories across the country worked around the clock to produce more. Women and men on the assembly lines felt pride in knowing that the aircraft they built was bringing their boys home safe. The Corsair wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise. Its performance continued to improve as engineers refined its design. The later variants, especially the F4U-1D and F4U-4, added even more horsepower, better visibility, and improved armament. The Corsair's top speed climbed to nearly 450 miles per hour, giving it an edge even over the newer Japanese designs. It could climb faster, dive steeper, and carry heavier payloads than anything the enemy possessed. It became, in many respects, the ultimate piston-engine fighter of World War II. When the Corsair finally joined carrier operations in full force, it cemented its dominance. The Navy, once skeptical of its carrier performance, now embraced it wholeheartedly. Pilots developed new landing techniques to compensate for its visibility issues, and modifications to the tailhook and landing gear made it more forgiving on approach. Soon, the Corsair was launching from carriers across the Pacific, leading bombing raids on Japanese strongholds and defending fleets from kamikaze attacks. The once-rejected plane had become indispensable. In these final months of the war, the Corsair's presence was overwhelming. Its blue wings filled the skies over Okinawa and the Philippine Sea. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory and destroyed targets on the ground with surgical precision. Japanese pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, could do little but watch as their airfields burned and their skies vanished. The Corsair had not only defeated the Zero, it had rendered its entire philosophy of air combat obsolete. And yet, amid the devastation, a strange respect persisted between the pilots of both nations. They understood one another in ways few others could. They had faced each other in the most unforgiving of arenas, risking everything for their countries, their comrades, and their honor. When Japanese pilots spoke of the Corsair after the war, they rarely did so with bitterness. Instead, they described it as an adversary worthy of the fight, a machine that demanded the best from anyone who dared to face it. For the Americans, that respect was mutual. The Corsair's pilots knew how skilled the Japanese had been, how deadly the Zero was in its prime. The laughter that had once surrounded the Corsair's debut wasn't malicious. It was ignorance. The war had dispelled that ignorance on both sides. In the end, the Corsair's story wasn't just about victory. It was about understanding. It was about how technology, courage, and determination could transform ridicule into reverence. As 1945 dawned, the Corsair stood at the apex of its dominance. The Pacific had become its kingdom, the skies its throne. Every major American offensive, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, was shadowed by the thunder of its engine. It was everywhere, soaring high above carriers, streaking low over beaches, sweeping across jungles, and circling smoking battlefields. The Marines and sailors who saw it overhead took comfort in its sound. They called it the voice of deliverance. To the Japanese, that same sound was the whisper of doom. It had once been an object of mockery, the so-called flying mistake. Now, its presence meant the end of whatever fight remained. At Okinawa, the Corsair was more than a fighter. It was the shield and sword of the American fleet. Japanese kamikaze attacks had reached terrifying intensity. Every day, waves of desperate pilots hurled their aircraft toward the U.S. invasion force. Against such madness, speed and power were the only defenses. The Corsair, with its blistering acceleration and firepower, became the fleet's guardian. Pilots scrambled from carrier decks at dawn and didn't rest until nightfall, intercepting kamikazes before they could reach the ships. Many of them fought to exhaustion, flying 5 or 6 sorties a day. The sky over Okinawa became a chaotic battleground of smoke, flame, and sacrifice. One Corsair pilot, Lieutenant Dean Diz Laird, later described those missions with quiet pride. "You didn't think about dying. You thought about how many you could stop before they hit the fleet. That's what mattered." He and his comrades formed a living wall between the kamikazes and the ships below. Each successful interception saved hundreds of lives. The Corsair's speed allowed it to chase down enemy planes before they could dive, and its 6 machine guns tore through them like paper. It was brutal work, but it was necessary. The Marines and sailors who watched from the decks below never forgot the sight. Corsairs diving headlong into fire, smoke trailing from their wingtips, yet pressing on to meet the enemy. The Japanese pilots, many of them barely trained, faced impossible odds. They flew outdated aircraft, often overloaded with explosives, into the teeth of American firepower. They were driven by desperation and belief, but against the Corsair's disciplined fury, they were helpless. For every kamikaze that broke through, dozens were cut down by the bent-wing fighters. The sky over Okinawa became littered with wreckage. It was both awe-inspiring and tragic, the final act of a war that had begun in arrogance and was ending in sacrifice. As Japan's air force withered, the Corsair continued its relentless campaign. It bombed airfields, strafed railways, and attacked shipping lanes. Even after Japan's cities were reduced to ashes by B-29 raids, Corsairs prowled the skies, ensuring no resistance remained. For American pilots, there was a growing sense of inevitability. The war was ending, and they knew it. The Corsair had done its job. It had turned laughter into fear, and fear into surrender. The Japanese Empire, once confident in its invincibility, was now at the mercy of the very machine it had mocked. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Corsair was already preparing for what would have been the invasion of Japan. Thousands of aircraft stood ready across Pacific bases, waiting for the order that, mercifully, never came. For the pilots who had survived years of combat, the end was bittersweet. They were proud, relieved, but also haunted. Many had spent so long fighting that they couldn't imagine life without the Corsair beneath them and the enemy in front of them. The war's end brought peace, but also emptiness. The sound of the whistling death faded from the skies, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural. In Japan, the aftermath was one of devastation and reflection. The surviving pilots who had fought against the Corsair spoke of it with a mixture of awe and sorrow. It was like fighting a mountain, one recalled. No matter how hard you tried, it never moved, never broke. For them, the Corsair represented not just defeat, but the realization that the age of the Zero, the age of elegance and lightness, was over. The future belonged to machines like the Corsair, heavier, faster, stronger, more ruthless. The laughter that had once accompanied the sight of its bent wings was a distant memory now, replaced by respect tinged with regret. When peace returned, so did the Corsair, this time in peacetime colors, gleaming and proud at airfields across the United States. Veterans would stand beside it at air shows, pointing out the scars on the metal, the bullet holes patched over with new rivets. Children stared up at it with wide eyes, unable to believe that this machine had once ruled the skies. For the men who had flown it, the memories were never far away. The roar of its engine could bring tears to their eyes, a sound that carried both triumph and loss. In the years that followed, the Corsair's legend was immortalized in books, films, and television. But for those who had been there, no dramatization could capture the real thing: the smell of oil and gunpowder, the feel of the stick trembling under their hands, the sight of a burning Zero spiraling into the sea. It was a history written in adrenaline and fear, in split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The Corsair's pilots carried that history within them for the rest of their lives. Many said that nothing after the war ever felt as real again. The plane itself refused to fade quietly into the background of history. Long after jets replaced propeller-driven fighters, the Corsair continued to serve in smaller air forces around the world. In conflicts from Indochina to Central America, its unmistakable silhouette appeared again, diving from the clouds, engines howling. Even in these later wars, it earned respect for its ruggedness and reliability. Few machines have lived such long, varied lives, born in doubt, baptized in fire, and surviving into an entirely new era. But the Corsair's greatest legacy was not its longevity or even its kill count. It was the lesson it taught about perception and perseverance. It proved that greatness often hides behind ridicule, that genius can look ungainly, and that the measure of a machine, or a man, is not how it begins, but how it endures. The Japanese pilots who laughed at it learned that lesson in the hardest possible way. They had seen its awkward wings and long nose and thought it clumsy. They never realized that those same features made it unstoppable. Decades later, when American and Japanese veterans met at reunions, the Corsair often came up in conversation. The laughter had long since turned to smiles of mutual respect. Some of the Japanese pilots even admitted that in their hearts they had admired the Corsair, even as it hunted them. It was terrifying, one said, but beautiful in its own way. That beauty was not in its shape, but in what it represented: the relentless pursuit of improvement, the triumph of adaptation, and the courage to fly into danger no matter how high the odds. By the late 1940s, the world was entering a new era. The jet age had begun, and the piston-engine fighters that had defined World War II were slowly being retired. Yet, even as the sleek new aircraft took to the skies, the Corsair remained. It was too capable, too proven, and too beloved to be discarded. For many pilots, transitioning to jets felt like saying goodbye to a trusted friend. The Corsair had saved their lives, carried them through fire, and brought them home. Letting go of it was like letting go of a piece of themselves. In the years immediately after the war, the Corsair found new roles in peacetime militaries and developing nations. It served with distinction in France, Britain, and several Latin American countries. The French Navy, in particular, used the Corsair extensively during its post-war colonial campaigns. In Indochina, over the jungles of Vietnam and Laos, the Corsair once again demonstrated its strength as a close air support aircraft. The same characteristics that had made it formidable in the Pacific, its power, toughness, and versatility, made it equally suited to the rough conditions of Southeast Asia. French pilots came to rely on it the same way the Marines had years before, and they too gave it nicknames that reflected both affection and fear. The Corsair also saw combat in Algeria, providing air support for French ground forces in brutal desert warfare. By then, it was already a relic compared to emerging jet fighters, but it continued to deliver results. In some ways, the Corsair had transcended its own generation. It was no longer defined by the war it was built for. It had become a global workhorse, adaptable and enduring. Pilots who flew it decades after its debut still spoke of its incredible handling and power. Even as technology raced ahead, the Corsair held its ground, refusing to be forgotten. Meanwhile, in the United States, it became a symbol of nostalgia and pride. Museums began restoring surviving Corsairs, preserving them as living artifacts of an age when courage and engineering combined to change the course of history. Veterans associations raised funds to keep them flying, ensuring that the thunder of the whistling death would never be silenced completely. Air shows across America featured Corsairs soaring in formation, their distinctive wings cutting through the sky as they once did over the Pacific. The crowds below would look up in awe, just as their parents and grandparents had, feeling for a moment the echo of a time when that sound meant both fear and freedom. For Japan, the Corsair's story became part of a broader reflection on the war. The laughter that had once met its arrival had long since turned into contemplation. Historians and engineers studied it closely, not with resentment, but with curiosity and admiration. They saw in it a design philosophy that was radically different from their own, one that emphasized power, durability, and adaptability over elegance. Many Japanese designers would later credit the lessons learned from facing the Corsair with influencing post-war innovations in engineering and aviation. The aircraft that had once symbolized their defeat had, in an ironic twist, become part of the foundation for their technological rebirth. Yet beyond its technical legacy, the Corsair represented something more profound: the story of underestimated potential. It was the embodiment of the idea that appearances could deceive, that innovation often came disguised as imperfection. When the Japanese pilots laughed at its strange wings and ungainly shape, they were seeing the future through the lens of the past. The Corsair was not just another fighter, it was a glimpse of what warfare was becoming: fast, brutal, and dominated by machines that favored performance over poise. The laughter stopped not because of fear alone, but because the world had changed and the Corsair had shown them how. For the American pilots who flew it, the Corsair was never just a machine of war. It was a companion. Many of them gave their planes personal names: Marine's Dream, Lucybell, Big Hog, and Flying Nightmare. Each Corsair carried the mark of its pilot, painted with kill counts, insignia, and symbols of luck. Those markings told stories of victories won, of comrades lost, of moments when life and death hung in the balance. When the war ended, those planes were either scrapped or mothballed, but their stories lived on in the memories of those who had flown them. To many veterans, the Corsair was more than a weapon. It was the heartbeat of their youth. The post-war years also saw an outpouring of memoirs and writings from Corsair pilots. Their accounts painted a vivid picture of the Pacific skies, of the chaos, the fear, the adrenaline, and the moments of strange beauty amidst destruction. They described the way the sun glinted off the ocean as they dove toward enemy formations, the smell of salt and oil, the shock of tracer rounds streaking past the canopy. For many, flying the Corsair was not just combat, it was an experience that defined their lives. They had witnessed both the worst and the best of humanity from behind that long nose and those iconic wings. As time passed, the Corsair's image began to transcend history itself. It became a cultural symbol, a representation of triumph over adversity, of courage under fire, of flawed beginnings turned to greatness. Documentaries, novels, and films retold its story in countless ways, often focusing on the irony of its early ridicule. The phrase, "they laughed at the Corsair," became shorthand for any situation in which doubt turned to admiration. Its legacy was not confined to the battlefield, it became part of how people understood perseverance and innovation. One of the most powerful aspects of the Corsair's story is its poetic symmetry. It began as a fighter mocked for its odd design, dismissed by its own navy, and underestimated by its enemies. Yet through persistence, ingenuity, and sheer willpower, it became one of the most successful aircraft of the Second World War. That journey mirrored the broader narrative of the war itself, a story of setbacks turned into strength, of ridicule transformed into reverence. The Corsair was proof that greatness is often born from failure, and that those who laugh too soon may find themselves silenced in the end. In later years, surviving Corsair pilots would meet at reunions, standing together beside restored planes painted in the same deep blue they had once flown into combat. They would touch the metal, look up at the wings, and feel time fold in on itself. Some would talk about the friends who didn't come back. Others would simply stand in silence. For them, the Corsair wasn't just history. It was memory made tangible. It carried the voices of the fallen and the lessons of a generation that had faced unimaginable odds and prevailed. For the Japanese veterans who met their American counterparts in peace, the Corsair became a bridge between past enemies. They spoke not of hatred, but of understanding. Both sides had flown, fought, and risked everything for their countries. Both had seen bravery and loss, and both had come to respect the strange machine that had once divided them. "It was not the shape that mattered," one Japanese pilot said decades later, looking at a Corsair on display. "It was the heart behind it." Time has a way of softening even the hardest memories, and as the decades passed, the Corsair's story began to take on an almost mythical quality. For those who had lived through the Second World War, it was a reminder of courage and sacrifice. For later generations, it became a symbol of innovation, the idea that what seems strange or foolish at first might one day reshape the world. Aviation historians wrote about it with near reverence, calling it the machine that shouldn't have worked, but did. And every time one of the few remaining Corsairs fired up its engine at an air show, people turned their heads instinctively toward the sound, as if the past itself had come roaring back to life. The Japanese pilots who had once faced the Corsair often described their encounters with it as both terrifying and humbling. Many of them had entered the war filled with confidence, certain of Japan's superiority in the air. They had trained in a culture that prized precision and elegance, where dogfighting was almost an art form. Then the Corsair arrived, a brute force of engineering that shattered that ideal. Its sheer power rewrote the rules of combat. They could no longer rely on nimbleness alone. They were forced into battles where survival depended on strength and strategy, not beauty and grace. For them, the Corsair represented not just defeat, but transformation. It was a harsh teacher, showing them that even mastery can become obsolete in the face of change. For American engineers, the Corsair was the perfect expression of wartime innovation. Its success wasn't the result of luck. It was the product of relentless problem-solving. Each flaw became an opportunity for improvement. The landing gear that had once bounced the aircraft off carrier decks was redesigned. The cockpit visibility that once endangered pilots was improved. The engine was fine-tuned until it sang with precision. It was engineering as evolution, each version smarter, faster, more refined than the last. By the time the F4U variant entered service near the war's end, it was nearly perfect. A blend of raw power and polished design that few could rival. The Corsair's technical achievements alone would have secured its place in history, but its true legacy came from the men who flew it. Their courage and determination elevated the machine beyond the sum of its parts. They faced overwhelming odds, harsh conditions, and a ruthless enemy, yet they fought with unshakable faith in their aircraft and in each other. Pilots often said that the Corsair had a personality, a temper even, but once you learned to handle it, it would never betray you. "She's tough, but she's loyal," one veteran said in a post-war interview. "If you respect her, she'll bring you home." That sentiment echoed through squadrons across the Pacific. Respect the plane, trust the plane, and the plane will take care of you. Meanwhile, the Corsair continued to serve quietly in corners of the world where wars still smoldered. In Latin America, small air forces flew it long after jet fighters became the norm. The last recorded use of the Corsair in combat came in 1969 during the so-called Soccer War between Honduras and El Salvador. It was an odd, tragic conflict sparked by politics and pride, but in the skies, something remarkable happened. Piston-engine fighters battled each other one last time, decades after most of the world had moved on. Among them were aging Corsairs, still deadly, still graceful in their own fierce way. Even in that strange war, the bent-wing bird proved that it could hold its own. In the United States, the Corsair's legend was preserved through storytelling as much as through history books. The television series Ba Ba Black Sheep, which dramatized the adventures of Pappy Boyington's squadron, introduced the aircraft to new generations. Children who watched the show in the 1970s and 1980s became the historians and pilots of today, inspired by the roaring blue fighter that seemed to leap from the screen. For them, the Corsair wasn't just an old plane, it was a myth made real, a reminder that ingenuity could triumph even in the darkest times. What made the Corsair's story so enduring was its contrast, the way it bridged opposites. It was ungainly yet beautiful, difficult yet dependable, mocked yet magnificent. It represented both chaos and control, destruction and salvation. In its gull wings and roaring engine, people saw a reflection of humanity itself, flawed, determined, and endlessly adaptable. The Corsair didn't just win battles, it symbolized the power of perseverance, of refusing to be defined by failure. In Japan, decades after the war, a few surviving Zero pilots gathered to reflect on what the Corsair had meant to them. One of them, an elderly man named Saburo Kei, spoke softly at a veterans event. "When we saw that shape in the sky, we knew we had met something different. It wasn't just faster, it was stronger in spirit. We learned from it. It taught us that courage alone is not enough. You must also change." His words captured something deeper than rivalry. They captured the strange, bittersweet respect that had grown between former enemies who had tested each other in the most brutal classroom imaginable. The Corsair's story also found its way into classrooms and museums as a symbol of how technology evolves through adversity. Students of aeronautics studied its design to understand how innovation often emerges from constraint. Its inverted gull wing, once ridiculed as unnecessary, became a case study in functional creativity. The problem it solved, fitting a massive propeller onto a compact airframe, was an elegant example of engineering pragmatism. In solving one challenge, Vought's engineers had created an icon. Even in the age of supersonic flight and stealth aircraft, the Corsair's lessons in design remained relevant. Understand the problem deeply and let function dictate form, no matter how strange that form might appear. But beyond the textbooks and exhibits, the Corsair lived on in the hearts of those who had seen it in action. For the Marines who had fought on the ground, its sound meant survival. For the sailors at sea, it meant protection. And for the Japanese soldiers who had endured its assaults, it was the harbinger of defeat and the end of an era. To each it carried a different meaning, but to all, it was unforgettable. Few machines have ever left such an imprint on so many lives. Even today at airfields around the world, a handful of Corsairs still take to the skies. Their engines rumble like distant thunder, their wingtips gleam in the sunlight, and their pilots, modern men and women who fly them for love rather than war, feel the same surge of power that once coursed through their predecessors. When those planes roll down the runway and lift into the air, history stirs. The laughter that once greeted the Corsair's debut is long gone, but the awe remains. Watching it climb, bank, and dive, one can almost hear the ghosts of the past whispering through the wind. And perhaps that is the greatest tribute of all, that after so many decades the Corsair still commands respect. It no longer fights, but it still inspires. It no longer destroys, but it still moves hearts. Its story, from ridicule to reverence, reminds us that greatness often begins in doubt, that even the most unlikely creations can change the world. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at it could never have known that they were witnessing the birth of a legend. Yet, in the end, their laughter became part of that legend, a prelude to awe, a necessary contrast that makes the Corsair's triumph all the more powerful. The Corsair's legend lived on, not because it was flawless, but because it was forged through its flaws. Its journey from ridicule to reverence mirrored the very essence of innovation. Every time it was doubted, it answered with results. Every setback only sharpened its edge. When people called it clumsy, it outran everything. When they said it couldn't land on carriers, it mastered the seas. When enemies laughed at its shape, it filled their skies with fire. In the end, it was the aircraft that taught the world not to judge potential by appearances, a lesson as timeless as the machine itself. The post-war decades brought new perspectives on the Corsair. As aviation historians began documenting the technical evolution of World War II aircraft, the Corsair stood out as an example of how engineering genius often hides behind apparent imperfection. Its silhouette, once a punchline, became a symbol of boldness in design. The inverted gull wing that had seemed so odd in 1942 was now recognized as a stroke of brilliance, a creative solution to a practical problem. The plane's long nose, once mocked, was admired for housing one of the most powerful radial engines ever installed on a fighter. Every curve, every rivet, every mistake had meaning. Veterans who had flown the Corsair often spoke of it as more than a machine. They called it alive. When it roared into the air, it seemed to have its own will, its own defiance. Pilots recalled how it bucked against their control during takeoff, as if challenging them to prove their worth. But once tamed, it responded with precision and loyalty. There was something almost personal about the relationship between man and machine. Many veterans described it in spiritual terms. "You didn't just fly a Corsair," one said. "You wrestled with it, earned its respect, and once it trusted you, it would never let you down." That bond was part of what made the Corsair's story so enduring. It wasn't simply a marvel of metal and mechanics. It was a companion in survival, a co-conspirator in history. The Marines who flew it in the Pacific, the Navy pilots who launched from carriers, the ground troops who looked up and cheered at its arrival, all of them carried the Corsair's legacy forward. It was the sound of protection, the sight of hope. For the Japanese, it was the symbol of their downfall. For the Americans, it was proof that perseverance could conquer any obstacle. As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, the Corsair's time in active combat slowly came to an end. Jet technology had surpassed it in speed and altitude, and new wars demanded new tools. But even as it retired from battle, the Corsair refused to fade away. Aviation enthusiasts around the world began restoring them, not just as museum pieces, but as living tributes to an era when courage and creativity changed the course of history. Airfields across America, Britain, and even Japan saw these restored Corsairs take to the skies once more. Their engines thundered just as they had decades before, echoing across fields and valleys, reminding everyone who heard them that legends never truly die. It's said that when a Corsair starts its engine, the sound is unlike any other aircraft. It begins with a deep growl, then rises into a steady, throaty roar that vibrates through the ground and into the bones of everyone nearby. For the old veterans, that sound is memory incarnate. They close their eyes, and they are back in the Pacific, flying through sun-bleached clouds, the sea glinting below, enemy tracers slicing through the air. The years melt away. For a few moments, they are young again, gripping the stick, adrenaline burning through their veins, alive in a way that only combat pilots can understand. When those veterans pass away, their stories pass to younger generations. The restorers, the historians, the enthusiasts who refuse to let the Corsair's roar go silent. Many of them never fought in a war, but they feel a deep connection to the machine and the men who once did. They see in it something rare: authenticity. The Corsair is not romanticized perfection. It is raw, scarred, and real. It carries the fingerprints of the past, the dents of battle, the patched bullet holes, the worn grips on the throttle. Each surviving. Aircraft is a time capsule, holding within it the echoes of laughter, fear, and courage that once filled its cockpit. And though decades have passed since it last faced an enemy in anger, the Corsair still commands reverence in the skies. At air shows, when a restored F4U banks into the sun, the crowd instinctively gasps. Children point upward, mesmerized by the gull wings slicing through the light. Older spectators nod silently, recognizing the shape, remembering the stories. Even those who know little of aviation can feel the aura it carries, the weight of history, the triumph hidden within its hum. It's almost poetic that the same traits that made the Corsair so difficult to love in its early days are what make it beloved now. Its imperfections, once liabilities, became the very things that gave it character. It was never sleek like a Spitfire, never as graceful as a Zero, but it was something rarer, indomitable. It had the rough-hewn charm of a machine that earned its glory the hard way. People respect that. They always have, even if it took them a while to realize it. In Japan, too, the Corsair's legacy evolved with time. The generation that had once fought against it began teaching the next about its lessons. In aviation museums across the country, alongside the elegant Zero, there are now exhibits dedicated to the Corsair, presented not as an enemy, but as an example of engineering brilliance. The laughter that had greeted it in 1942 has long since turned to admiration. Japanese engineers, known for their meticulous craftsmanship, came to see in the Corsair a kindred spirit, a design born from necessity, executed with daring precision. The fighter that had once symbolized their defeat became, paradoxically, a source of inspiration. The Corsair's influence even reached beyond aviation. In design schools and engineering programs, it became a case study in problem-solving under pressure. Professors used its story to teach students that innovation often looks ugly at first, that progress is rarely neat, and that success often wears the face of failure before revealing its true form. The Corsair became more than a plane. It became a philosophy. And that philosophy spread far beyond the hangar or the battlefield. For those who understand its story, the Corsair represents something deeply human. It is the story of persistence, of transformation, of quiet revenge against doubt. The Japanese pilot's laughter at its strange design was not cruel. It was natural. They were experts looking at the unknown, measuring it against what they knew. They didn't realize that the world had already begun to move beyond their understanding. The Corsair was the future disguised as a joke, and when the future arrived, it came whistling through the clouds with machine guns blazing. The beauty of that irony ensures the Corsair's immortality. The laughter, the fear, the triumph, they are all woven into the sound of its engine. When it flies today, it carries not just the memory of war, but the lesson of change. It whispers to every dreamer, every inventor, every underdog. Don't be discouraged by doubt. The strange, the unconventional, the misunderstood, these are often the things that change the world. As decades passed and the veterans grew older, the Corsair's story began to transcend even the boundaries of aviation history. It became something symbolic, almost mythological, a living parable about resilience and the quiet power of persistence. People who had never flown a plane, who had never studied war, could still understand its meaning. The Corsair's tale was universal, the misunderstood underdog, mocked and doubted, who rose to change the world. That narrative resonated not only with pilots and engineers, but with anyone who had ever been underestimated, anyone who had ever been told that their dream was too strange, too difficult, too impossible. To historians, the Corsair was a turning point in aerial warfare. It marked the transition between two eras, the romantic, acrobatic dogfights of the early war, and the brutal high-speed battles of industrial air power. Before the Corsair, fighters had been designed with elegance and lightness in mind, prioritizing maneuverability over muscle. The Japanese Zero was the pinnacle of that philosophy, graceful, efficient, and deadly in the hands of an expert. But the Corsair was something else entirely. It represented a new way of thinking, a shift from art to science, from intuition to engineering. It was a machine built for total war, where survival depended not on agility, but on strength, speed, and adaptability. This change didn't just happen in design, it happened in mentality. The pilots who flew the Corsair learned to fight differently. They no longer sought the dance of aerial duels, but the precision of calculated strikes. They used altitude, energy, and coordination. Every move had purpose. Every battle was a test of physics as much as skill. It was a colder, more mechanical way of fighting, yet it reflected the reality of modern war. The Corsair was the perfect instrument for that new world, ruthless, reliable, and relentless. But what made its story so compelling was that despite its mechanical might, it never lost its human connection. The pilot's relationship with the Corsair was intensely personal. They spoke of it as if it had a soul. "You could feel it breathe," one Marine pilot once said. "When the engine roared, it was like the heartbeat of something alive." Many of them carried photos of their aircraft in their wallets long after the war, as if the machine were a comrade. They remembered its quirks, the way it dipped slightly on takeoff, the whistle in its wings, the vibrations through the stick when the guns fired. Those sensations stayed with them forever. For the Japanese pilots, the Corsair became a phantom. It haunted their memories long after the war. The sound of its approach, the sight of those distinctive wings diving through the clouds, it all lingered like a recurring dream. Some even described it with reluctant admiration, calling it the Iron Hawk, or the Blue Thunder. They knew that in facing it, they had faced the best of what their enemy could create, and for many, that knowledge brought a strange peace. They had not been defeated by luck or numbers alone. They had been defeated by excellence. Back in America, as the years turned into decades, the Corsair's fame was rekindled with each new generation. Its story appeared in magazines, documentaries, and museums. Children built scale models of it, painting the same deep navy blue and adding the tiny white stars on its wings. Pilots and historians spoke about it at schools and events, passing on the legend like a sacred torch. And when one of the few remaining airworthy Corsairs took flight, people stopped what they were doing to watch. The gull wings glistened in the sunlight, the propeller blurred into motion, and for a moment, time folded back on itself. The world could almost hear the laughter that once filled the Japanese hangars, and the silence that followed. There is a moment often recounted by airshow announcers when the Corsair banks low over the runway, its engine growling. The sound fills the air, thick, deep, unmistakable. Spectators feel it in their chests, that vibration that once echoed across the Pacific. And as it pulls up, climbing sharply into the blue sky, people cheer. Not just for the machine, but for what it represents. They cheer for the men who flew it, for the engineers who built it, for the story it carries. They cheer because they understand, even subconsciously, that this plane was once a joke that became a legend. That transformation, laughter into fear, ridicule into awe, is why the Corsair's story endures. It's why writers still tell it, why filmmakers still recreate it, and why historians still study it. It's not merely about war, it's about redemption. The Corsair's strange, awkward beginnings remind us that genius often hides in imperfection, that innovation requires risk, and that those who mock what they don't understand may one day find themselves outpaced by it. It is a story that repeats itself in every era, in every field of human endeavor. When the last surviving Corsair pilots gather, they often talk less about the battles and more about the camaraderie. They remember the long nights in humid tents, the smell of fuel on their hands, the way the ocean looked at dawn as they prepared for missions. They speak of their fallen comrades with reverence, their voices heavy with emotion. And always, somewhere in their stories, the Corsair appears, not as an object, but as a presence. It was there in their triumphs, in their fears, in their losses. It was part of their lives in a way that few things ever could be. For the younger generation listening to those veterans, the Corsair represents something both distant and immediate. Distant because it belongs to another time, immediate because its lessons are eternal. They see in it the truth that progress often begins with rejection, that failure is a step toward greatness, and that belief in one's work can outlast even the harshest criticism. The Corsair's story becomes a metaphor for creativity itself, for the courage to build something no one else believes in. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, that the laughter of those Japanese pilots, once a sound of derision, became the overture to one of history's greatest triumphs of design. Their mockery gave the Corsair's story its heartbeat. Without it, there would be no contrast, no transformation, no meaning. It was the laughter that made the victory sweeter, the silence that followed more profound. In the end, the Corsair didn't just conquer the skies, it conquered doubt itself. Even today, when historians write about it, they often end with a quote that captures the poetry of its journey. They laughed at the gull-winged monster until its whistle was the last sound they ever heard. That line, simple and haunting, sums up everything the Corsair came to represent. The fine line between ridicule and reverence, between mockery and marvel, between the past and the future. The Corsair's story, though born in war, ultimately became a story of peace, of how the lessons of conflict can shape a better world. When the gunfire stopped and the skies fell quiet, the men who had once flown against each other were left to ponder what it had all meant. In that silence, many of them found a strange kinship that transcended national lines. American and Japanese veterans alike spoke of their respect for each other's courage, for the shared experience of facing death in the air, and for the machines that had carried them through it. And at the center of those conversations, time and again, was the Corsair. To the American pilots, it represented survival and victory. To the Japanese, it symbolized the end of an era, the day when their invincible Zero met its match. Yet to both, it came to represent the same thing: the relentless forward march of innovation. The Corsair had changed the rules of air combat forever. It had shown that the future belonged to those who dared to challenge convention, to question assumptions, to build something different even when everyone laughed. It wasn't just a machine. It was an idea given wings. Even in the post-war years, that idea continued to inspire. Many of the engineers who had worked on the Corsair went on to design new generations of aircraft, carrying its spirit of boldness into the jet age. They remembered the lessons they had learned from its creation: that progress is never comfortable, that failure is part of discovery, and that the strangest ideas sometimes hold the most promise. The Corsair had started as a problem, but it ended as proof that problems are the birthplace of progress. For the Japanese, the Corsair's arrival had been a painful but necessary awakening. It shattered the illusion that perfection had been achieved with the Zero. It forced a rethinking of their entire approach to warfare and technology. And in the years after the war, that rethinking bore fruit. The same engineers who had once built fighter planes for an empire now turned their talents to building the machines of peace: cars, ships, and electronics that would make Japan a world leader in innovation. In a strange way, the Corsair had contributed to that transformation. By defeating Japan's old way of thinking, it helped clear the path for its rebirth. In the United States, the Corsair became a symbol of what the nation could achieve when it refused to accept limitations. It had begun as a project that almost failed, plagued by setbacks and rejection. Yet through persistence and adaptation, it became one of the most successful aircraft of the war. That story resonated deeply with Americans, especially in the post-war years when the country was rebuilding and redefining itself. The Corsair was a reminder that perseverance and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. It became not just a weapon of victory, but a metaphor for the American spirit itself. In films and books, the Corsair took on a kind of cinematic grandeur. Its image, those sweeping gull wings against a backdrop of blue ocean, became instantly recognizable. Filmmakers used it to evoke both nostalgia and admiration, to remind audiences of a time when the world's fate hung in the balance and courage came in the form of young men and their machines. The Corsair's story fit perfectly into the larger mythology of World War II, a tale of underdogs, innovation, and the triumph of determination. But perhaps the most enduring part of its legacy lies not in the grand narratives, but in the small, personal stories. The pilot who crash-landed behind enemy lines and lived because his Corsair absorbed the bullets meant for him. The mechanic who worked through the night to patch up a plane so it could fly again at dawn. The Marine who looked up during a desperate battle and saw Corsairs swooping in, saving his unit from annihilation. These stories, quiet, human, and real, are what give the Corsair its lasting power. They remind us that history is not just written in victories, but in acts of endurance and faith. At air shows today, those stories echo in the eyes of the spectators who gather to watch the surviving Corsairs take flight. There's a reverent hush as the propeller begins to spin, the engine coughs to life, and that deep, throaty growl fills the air. People of all ages look up, captivated. Some see history, some see art, some see courage made tangible. And as the plane lifts off the runway and climbs into the sky, its wings gleaming in the sun, the crowd feels something almost spiritual. A connection to a time when the world was simpler, yet infinitely more dangerous, and when machines like this one carried the weight of hope itself. The Japanese visitors who attend those shows sometimes stand quietly, watching the Corsair with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. For them, it represents both a worthy opponent and a bridge to reconciliation. In conversations with American veterans, they speak of how the Corsair changed their understanding of war, not just as a contest of weapons, but as a contest of ideas. They talk about how it forced them to evolve, to adapt, to see beyond pride. And often those conversations end not in bitterness, but in friendship. Time has turned enemies into storytellers, and the Corsair has become the thread that connects them. In this way, the Corsair's legacy extends beyond the history books. It lives in the way people remember it, the lessons they draw from it, the respect it inspires even in those who once feared it. It stands as proof that innovation and courage can turn ridicule into reverence, that what begins as a joke can end as a legend. Its story endures not because it was perfect, but because it was human, flawed, fierce, and full of heart. Every time a Corsair engine roars to life, It's as if the past speaks again. The sound carries the laughter of those who once mocked it, the determination of those who built it, and the pride of those who flew it. It carries the fear of those who faced it in combat, the relief of those it saved, and the respect of those who came to understand it. It is not just noise, it is history, memory, and meaning all woven together into a single, unbroken roar. And so, when the old veterans watch it take off, their eyes often fill with tears. They see not just a plane, but a lifetime. They remember their comrades, their youth, their courage, and their losses. They remember the laughter that started it all and the silence that followed when the Corsair proved the world wrong. The gull-winged fighter that was once dismissed as too strange had become eternal. It had not only ruled the skies, it had conquered time. Even now, more than 80 years after its first flight, the Corsair remains a marvel, one of those rare machines that seems to carry its own heartbeat through time. When historians trace its lineage, they find not just the story of a plane, but the blueprint of modern innovation. It taught the world that progress is born from persistence, that even flawed beginnings can lead to perfection through patience and purpose. The Corsair was never the product of comfort. It was the child of adversity. Every nut, every bolt, every adjustment was shaped by necessity and tested in battle. It was, in every sense, a triumph of determination. As the last generation of pilots who flew it fade into history, their memories keep its spirit alive. Many of them spent their later years visiting schools, museums, and air shows, sharing their stories so that the world would remember not just the battles, but the humanity within them. They spoke of the camaraderie, the fear, the exhaustion, and the pride. They spoke of the Corsair as if it were an old friend, a friend who had been there in the worst of times, when the sky was a storm of fire and survival seemed like a miracle. And every time they told those stories, they kept the plane alive a little longer. For younger generations, the Corsair's legend carries a different kind of meaning. It's a reminder that genius often wears the mask of failure. The Japanese laughed when they first saw it, just as many Americans doubted it before its potential was realized. It looked wrong, it behaved badly, and it scared its own pilots. But that's what made it extraordinary, because it refused to be ordinary. It was never about fitting in, it was about breaking through. And that defiance, that refusal to be bound by expectation, is what makes it timeless. Across the Pacific, in Japan, the Corsair's story has also found its place in the collective memory. Younger historians there study it with a sense of detached respect, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a chapter in the shared history of aviation. They understand now what their predecessors could not, that progress is a dialogue, and even enemies can learn from one another. In Japanese museums, displays of the Zero often stand beside photographs of the Corsair, contrasting two philosophies of flight, one graceful and minimalist, the other bold and raw. Together they tell a story not of rivalry, but of evolution. In America, the Corsair stands today as an icon of ingenuity. Restored examples gleam in museums like the Smithsonian, the National Naval Aviation Museum, and countless local collections across the country. When visitors stand before them, they often fall silent. The sheer physical presence of the Corsair, the sweep of its wings, the size of its propeller, the scars still visible in its metal, commands attention. It's easy to imagine it in motion, roaring down a makeshift island runway, lifting off into the chaos of war, leaving behind nothing but dust and thunder. Some of those aircraft still fly, maintained by dedicated restorers who pour thousands of hours into keeping them airworthy. They are not just preserving machines, they are preserving voices. When the engines roar to life, they echo with the memories of the men who once flew them, the laughter, the fear, the courage. Each flight is a tribute, a salute to those who proved that greatness can rise from ridicule. Every time a Corsair climbs into the clouds, it carries those voices with it, whispering the same message. Never underestimate the strange, the different, the daring. There's an old photograph taken in the late 1940s after the war had ended. It shows a row of Corsairs sitting quietly on a sunlit airstrip, their wings folded like resting birds. In the background, a group of mechanics and pilots stand talking, relaxed, their helmets off, their faces young and weary. The war is over. The laughter, the fear, the roaring skies, all of it has passed. And yet, in that stillness, there is a sense of immortality. The Corsairs seem alive even in silence, as if waiting for the next horizon. That image captures what words sometimes cannot, the spirit of endurance that defined the plane and the people who built it. In later years, aviation writers often called the Corsair the last of the great piston kings. It had survived long enough to bridge the gap between eras, the twilight of propellers and the dawn of jets. It represented the peak of a technology pushed to its limits, the culmination of everything engineers had learned about flight before the world moved beyond it. To watch a Corsair fly today is to watch the end of an age, a mechanical swan song sung in blue and silver. And yet, even surrounded by the marvels of modern aviation, jets that break the sound barrier, drones that fly themselves, the Corsair still evokes awe. Perhaps it's because it speaks to something primal in us, the desire to rise above, to defy expectation, to turn laughter into silence. It is a reminder that every breakthrough begins as an impossibility. The first man to draw its shape on paper could not have known that he was sketching a legend. The first pilot to crash it on a carrier deck could not have guessed that future generations would call it one of the greatest fighters ever built. But that's what history does. It turns struggle into story, failure into triumph, ridicule into reverence. The Corsair's final lesson is not about war, but about humanity. It reminds us that progress demands courage, the courage to fail, to be mocked, to stand by an idea when the world calls it foolish. The Japanese pilot's laughter was not the sound of arrogance alone, it was the sound of familiarity recoiling from the unknown. Every great innovation provokes that same reaction. The Corsair simply had the courage to prove them wrong. When its engine roars across the sky at air shows today, people look up in wonder. They see a machine that should have been forgotten, but wasn't. They see proof that legends don't fade, they evolve. The Corsair no longer carries guns or bombs, but it still carries meaning. Its wings, once instruments of war, now carry stories of perseverance and peace. Its whistle, once a warning of death, is now a song of remembrance. In the end, the Corsair did more than ruin Japan's skies. It changed the way the world looked at the sky itself. It showed that innovation is born not from perfection, but from the willingness to endure imperfection. It proved that ridicule can be the first step toward greatness. And it left behind a legacy not of destruction, but of inspiration. So the next time you hear that deep, throaty roar echoing across an airfield, remember what it means. Remember the laughter of those who once doubted. Remember the courage of those who believed. Remember the blue wings that once ruled the Pacific and the whistle that silenced the mockery. Because that sound, the sound of the Corsair, isn't just the echo of history. It's the voice of defiance, the whisper of innovation, the heartbeat of every dream that was ever laughed at before it changed the world. And as the old saying goes, they laughed at the gull-winged monster until its whistle was the last sound they ever heard. That was not just a line in a story. It was the truth of a generation, carried on the wings of a legend that still flies.